Okay, so over the last 8 years now, we've seen a massive rise in poverty. A fifth of the UK population now live in poverty, and child poverty has gone up dramatically. Do you agree that this is an absolute disgrace? Do you agree that this has been caused by Conservative Party policies, and what would you do to change the situation?
And we'll get through more if we don't applaud the question. And now the woman, yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Mogg, Rees Mogg. It's Brenda from Bristol. I'd like to ask you what incentives the government are implementing to support SMEs in preparation for Brexit. I note that Enterprise Ireland, they have a scheme offering a €5,000 grant. And I'd like to know whether our government are likely to implement the same scheme.
Okay. On the issue of poverty, it very much depends on what figures you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with relative poverty or absolute poverty. Absolute poverty has continued to decline in this country, and interestingly, inequality is at its lowest level since 1985 in this country. And what the government has done with its welfare reforms, to my mind, has been really important. And as it's rolled out, as the universal credit is rolled out, key, because it will ensure that there is always an incentive to be employed rather than unemployed. It takes away the poverty trap. So, under the universal credit, 63% of benefits will be withdrawn for every pound earned. And that sounds high, and in my view it's too high, and it should be an object of policy to reduce it. But currently it's over 90% that is withdrawn, which means that people who go into work find that they can be worse off than if they remain on benefits. And the best way out of poverty is work, and that's always been the case. So the universal credit is the greatest answer to dealing with the poverty issue, but it's a relative poverty issue in this country, not an absolute poverty issue. In terms of what is the government doing to help SMEs, as far as I'm aware, there are no specific grants in relation to Brexit. What the government ought to be doing, and it's easier for me as a backbencher to say what the government ought to be doing, it should be ensuring that we get the benefits of Brexit, and that is taking some of the regulations off the shoulders of SMEs. It was rumoured before the last budget that the Chancellor wanted to lower the VAT threshold, so that more companies would have had the bureaucracy of dealing with VAT. It's completely the wrong way around. What we want to be doing is raising the VAT thresholds to take the administrative burden off companies. There's this whole proposal for digitisation of tax, so that companies, small companies, have to make quarterly returns. This is absolutely bananas. It will put people off going into business, and it will make small businesses have higher costs because they will simply have to pay their accountants more to make the returns. So what I would like to see us do is stop thinking of silly regulations that will make life of SMEs worse, and then once we've left the European Union, and that relates to the VAT threshold, which we can't put up until we've left the European Union, look at ways of easing regulations on SMEs so they can get on with the business of doing business, which is what they want.
Okay, I'll take the woman in the front row, one of my former students, always welcome back. And the chap in the sort of orangey shirt there. Yes, please.
Mr. Rees Mogg, I just wanted to ask you a quick something about the motion that was passed last night on restoration and renewal. Do you feel like, due to the fact that Parliament voted for a full decant, albeit temporary, do you feel that this could have a severe short-term and long-term effect on our well-evolved parliamentary democracy? Is there a risk that it may never return back to normal? And is Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, massively underestimating the impact this could have on our Parliament and how it functions?
Yeah, please.
Hi. In a hypothetical situation where you become Prime Minister in 10, 15 years' time, would you hold votes to change laws on same-sex marriage and abortion, or do you think they've been decided already and you just leave them as they are?
And on that subject, because I said I'd take some questions from social media from people in the other overflow room, someone has explicitly asked, would you stand under a Conservative leader who was pro-choice, pro-gay marriage and pro-trans rights in order to stop Jeremy Corbyn getting into Downing Street?
Okay, I'll answer all three of those questions. The first question on restoration and renewal. I was on the committee that looked at it, and the reason I voted against the motion yesterday was I think we need to start again on the basis of which we're doing it, because we voted in favour, and I agreed to this, to full decant on the basis that a temporary chamber could be put up in Richmond House, in the courtyard outside Richmond House, which would have been relatively cheap. It turned out that the people who had given us thousands of pages of report, these really expensive consultants, got their measurements wrong by 16 feet and 4 inches. And therefore they've got to knock down the whole of Richmond House and rebuild it, other than the facade which is listed. So it's even more expensive than just knocking the whole thing down. I then discovered today that the same approach had been done with the Elizabeth Tower. In the Elizabeth Tower, the price has doubled from 30 million to 60 million. And they were going to put a lift in it, but they've now discovered that the tower would have to be widened to do that because the height is so high that the coil that you need to wind the wires around that pull the lift up. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so forgive me if this is the ABC of engineering approach. They'd have to widen the tower to fit it in, which they can't do. So we get cost estimates that are completely wrong. We get facts, simple facts. It is not difficult to measure the side of a courtyard. And then we decide to spend £4 billion on the basis of wrong facts. And I think that's a great mistake and the wrong way to treat public money. To the heart of your question, there's a wonderful line of Winston Churchill's, which I paraphrase. He said, "We make our buildings and then our buildings make us." Part of our constitutional system is the chance that we started the House of Commons in St Stephen's Chapel and therefore were opposite each other. And that is why the debates are as they are. That's why we've got a two-party system. That is why we have an adversarial system. If we'd remained in the chapter house in Westminster Abbey, which is in a circle, our political life would be very difficult. So yes, there is a worry that if we move out and we move to some strange auditorium, we may find that we never move back and it has political consequences. On the two questions on some of the broader moral issues, the country has made up its mind on these issues. I have my views as a practicing Catholic, and my strongest view is on the issue of life, and that the point that life begins at conception and ends at natural death. I'm also opposed to capital punishment, as I said earlier, but also to euthanasia. I don't think it is right for the state to take life. And I think there are very practical reasons on the euthanasia issue as well. But the law is the settled opinion of the country. I may wish it were not so, but I'm not going to change that. I have no ability to change that. Would I serve under a Prime Minister who took a different view from me? Yes, of course I would. That Theresa May does not hold these views. I don't actually know in detail what her views are, but I am happy to support the leader of the Conservative Party because all these votes are free votes. They are conscience votes. And the conscience of the country is not in the same place as my conscience. But I believe in freedom of conscience, and I believe in democracy, and that therefore, if that is the state of play, that is something I accept. And it is for the country at large to decide these issues, and that's where they've been decided. So no, I'm not seeking to impose my conscience on the rest of society.
I understand that answer, but were you in the hypothetical situation that the questioner asked to be Prime Minister, whilst you couldn't impose because other people have views as well, you would not exactly be in a weak position, and you could at least guide and nudge to reopen some of these questions. And presumably, since these matters are so important to you, it would be an abdication of responsibility were you not to try to reopen debate on some of these questions.
I think you've got to be realistic about what you can do in politics. Margaret Thatcher was a strong believer in capital punishment, and she tried, as Prime Minister, to nudge people back in favour of capital punishment, and they would not be nudged. And the House of Commons consistently voted against it under her leadership. The Prime Minister's authority over the moral questions is very, very limited, and quite rightly, we don't want to live in Iran. And I don't see myself as being an Ayatollah. And so I have my views. I think they're very important, and I don't back away from them. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that I think my views are wrong, but they are not the law of the land, they are not going to be the law of the land, and it is quite right that other people's conscience should determine equally with mine, but mine as one conscience against many.
Okay, let's take some more from the floor. I knew we'd have hands flying up. We'll take the woman about 4 rows down. Yeah, with the burgundy top, please. And I'll take this chap here. Right, yeah, there. Yes, please. No, don't look round. Yep, you. Yeah. So, please.
Hi. I'd like to ask you about where you stand on the indefinite detention of asylum seekers, hundreds of which are kept in detention centres, 13 of them they're survivors of rape, of FGM, of human trafficking, and a lot of and there's been people have been vocal about this issue from all different sides of the political spectrum. So I was just wondering where you stand. You've not been shy to put principles before party politics, so I'd like to know where you stand.
Okay, and yes, please, sir.
Hello, yes. A journalist that I know said that if the Conservatives are unable to fix the housing crisis and allow the young to be able to buy their own homes or flats, then Jeremy Corbyn will be the next Prime Minister. Do you agree?
The question of holding people indefinitely is a really important one. We have to have a functioning system that ensures that people who come to this country can come legally, but we also have to have a system that recognises that some people come as genuine refugees who have suffered serious abuse, and to lock them up seems to me to be wrong, but we've got to know which is which. And do we get the balance right? I think it's very unlikely that we do, that the ability, the success of the Home Office in deporting people who are here illegally is very low. It's not a very well-functioning system. But I think we are a land of liberty, and we believe in liberty for everybody, and we believe in the rule of law for everybody. And that means respecting the rights of all people who are in this country, but we also have to have a system where people who have broken the rules can be safely deported. It is not always easy to get the balance right, and mistakes will be made. But if there's somebody, as you say, who has been raped or who has been tortured or suffered from FGM, then to be holding somebody in that situation in indefinite detention would be deeply troubling. On the question of housing, this is the real challenge for the Conservative Party. And one of the things I think most strongly as a Conservative is that what we're there to do as a party is to deliver as much of what people want as is possible and to take obstacles out of their way. I think, ladies and gentlemen, you make better choices about how to lead your life than I can make for you. I don't believe in the socialist approach that the collective is more important than the individual, and I don't therefore believe that you should be nudged to lead your life in the way that I think is good for you. And when you do opinion surveys, and this goes back to the introduction of the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947, as to what people want, 80% say they wish to live in houses with gardens. And it seems to me that is what the government ought to be delivering. Not tower blocks, not houses with no garden, not incredible dense housing, but housing with gardens. And to do that, as Conservatives, we have to challenge some of our supporters who have been saying we can't build on this space and that space and the next space. Do you know, the interesting thing is, most of our supporters are now ahead of us as politicians. I think the country at large recognises that we need to build hundreds of thousands of houses, and to do so we cannot protect every blade of grass in this country. And we should assume that people want the quality of housing that we all want for ourselves, and that should be made as easy for people to get as possible, but that means lots more building. And we should really look to help people in their ambition to own their own houses, because once people have a stake in society and you have a property-owning democracy, you have a more vibrant and active democracy, and yes, you appeal to younger people. You said that Sam upset everybody by wanting people
he upset me. He upset me. They all loved him. But
I'm going to upset you too. Who here wants to own his or her own home at the end of, by the time they're 30? Okay.
I know
Trevor,
there
I'm
are some
just wondering-
groans from those over 30s.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Almost all of you put your hands up for that. Now look, what do I think as a politician? What did I say? I should try and take the obstacles out of your path that allow you to lead the lives you want to lead. Therefore, we have a real challenge to build more houses, because if none of you are able to achieve those ambitions, why not have Jeremy Corbyn pinch everybody's money and give it to Caracas? So,
Okay, right. So, can we have a microphone for the lady with the glasses about 5 or 6 rows back, with the grey top and specs? And then we'll have the chap, the row in front, the ginger-haired chap as well. Yeah, yeah. See, there is an advantage to it. There is an advantage to it. Right, yes, please.
Okay. Hi. So you and some of your colleagues use your Christian faith to justify your stance on certain issues and topics. But when you look at the Gospels and what Jesus taught, there was such an emphasis on looking after the most poor and the most vulnerable and marginalised in society. Yet when you look at your own voting record, some of the arguments you make and rhetoric, and that of some of your colleagues, it seems like you ignore this fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. So I was just wondering what that's about.
And then, yeah.
Thank you. Obviously, Mr. Rees Mogg, you are on the Conservative wing of the Conservative Party. Do you think there is a place for classical liberalism in the Conservative Party?
I might ask them in reverse order, because that is a very easy question to answer, because I'm probably more of a classical liberal than you think, certainly in terms of economic policy, and I am not on the authoritarian wing of the Conservative Party in terms of law and order, and I believe in our ancient liberties, which I think are of great importance: the protection of trial by jury, the presumption of innocence rather than of guilt, the protection from unreasonable searches by agents of the state, the requirement, I've been very sympathetic to the pro-Europeans on the issue of Henry VIII clauses, because I don't think the executive should have power to tell us all what to do without any say-so of Parliament. So I'm more of a classical liberal than I might want to admit to myself, but certainly than some of you may think. To come to the question of Christianity and the teaching of the Gospels, and your basic question, am I a Pharisee? Which I think is a very interesting point. I believe that conservative solutions help the poorest in society most. Okay, let me tell you what I want from Brexit. I want us to take tariffs off food, clothing and footwear. Food, clothing and footwear make up 21% of the average family's budget. But for the poorest in society, that is a higher percentage, inevitably. The average tariff on clothing and footwear is about 11.5% plus 20% VAT. So you're talking about 13.5% to 14% tariffs on clothing and footwear. On food, the tariffs are so high that there's very little import from outside the European Union. If you can make the 21% of people's expenditure, and it's more, as I say, for the poorest in society, 20% lower once you've taken off the tariffs and you've taken away the non-tariff barriers, that is a dramatic improvement in the standard of living in the poorest in society. And frankly, it makes remarkably little difference to the richest in society, who have a much lower expenditure on those essentials. That's why I say conservatism helps the poorest in society. Go back to Margaret Thatcher and the sale of council... Thank you. The sale of council houses was transformative in allowing people to become part of a property-owning democracy, to give them a real stake in society. And it allowed people freedom over their own lives. They weren't any longer told by the council what colour they had to paint their front door. And it gave people a stake in their society, it gave their children a stake in society, and it helped get people out of poverty. These things are really transformative, and they are conservative. And I have never thought that you make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. It doesn't work. It's been tried and it fails. capitalism actually lifts everybody. And if you don't believe me, okay, if you don't believe me, look at the transformation globally as China and India have become capitalist. If you go back to 1980, over 50% of the world was living on under $1 a day. This is now under 20%, and it's almost entirely down to China and India, and China and India have abandoned socialism. And that has lifted the poorest in the world standard of living. And those of us who are capitalists should be really proud of that, because that is a capitalist success.
I promised I'd read some out, so I'll read two more quick ones for you, and then we'll take some more from the audience. Someone said, since you said you would be honest in your answers, do you honestly believe Theresa May will be Prime Minister by the 31st of March 2019? This one, I think I know how you will answer this one. Did you enjoy Frankie Boyle's description of you as, quote, a composite drawn from the nightmares of 18th century mill workers?
Yes, and I think most of the mill workers were 19th century rather than 18th century, so I would have enjoyed it more if he'd been a little bit more historically accurate.
Right. Okay, we will take I'll take this woman in the front row with the black hair, and then I'll take this woman also in about the third row with the black hair, please. Yeah.
Do you agree with the decision to remove grid girls from the F1 and other sports and things like this?
And please.
So you've been quite vocal in saying that you're critical of Treasury's analysis against Brexit, but I wonder how critical were you of the analysis that was being presented in favour of Brexit leading up to the referendum? For instance, ones that were found to be not exactly accurate, like the savings that could go to the NHS and everything.
Okay, so we got grid girls and that damn bus. Yeah.
It's a really interesting question, because I believe in a free society where people should be free to do what they want, and that it's therefore, I think, not an area where the state should say yes or no. But as you know, I'm quite old-fashioned. And I believe in treating ladies with respect. And I don't think Grid Girls is treating ladies with respect. I think it is viewing them, it's objectifying them. And frankly, I've never felt comfortable with it. We have in the hall one of the most distinguished political commentators of our time. And I'm quite glad that his newspaper no longer has a naked lady on page 3, because its political commentary was always on page 2. And I always felt rather embarrassed reading page 2 when there was this picture on page 3. So I think it's all about treating people with respect, which I am so strongly in favour of doing. And therefore, perhaps I'm just an old prude, bit of a stuffed shirt. I'm quite happy that these things are fading out. I don't think they add to society. But I don't want to enforce my will in this area on other people. I think it's for society to decide, for the Grid Girls to decide, for Formula One to decide. I don't think it's a matter for legislation. On the bus, big six-wheeler, scarlet-painted, 97 horsepower diesel bus, to quote Flanders and Swan, always worth quoting. As an aside, I went on safari on honeymoon, and it's amazing my marriage lasted 3 weeks because I kept on singing the Flanders and Swan songs about the various animals we kept on seeing. Anyway, leaving that to one side, in any campaign, people use figures that are available to them to promote their cause. I did not, as it happens, like the £350 million figure, but it wasn't untrue. It was a figure that you came to if you added up our gross contributions annually to the European Union. And therefore, it was of a much less misleading type than the figure produced by the Treasury that I think said we would all lose £4,800, 27p and a farthing if we voted to leave. And the Bank of England, who I thought was particularly disgraceful, I kept on asking the Governor of the Bank of England, why didn't he say, before a general election, the consequences of another party's policies? Never gave a view on that, because it's not for the Bank of England, an independent body, to dip its hands in political controversy. But the Bank of England, as part of the Project Fear, decided to besmirch its own reputation. And that was a sadness, because I admire the Bank of England, or did historically, and many people did. So I don't think the 350 million figure was as bad or as egregious as the figures that came out in the Treasury. And I think the Treasury abused its official status and the money, our money, taxpayers' money, to campaign on one side rather than the other. And I thought that was completely improper. At least the slogan on the side of the bus was paid for by volunteers, by donors. It wasn't taxpayers' money paying for that. The junk that was coming out of the Treasury was paid for by you, ladies and gentlemen.
On that subject, and again, picking up a question that someone's tweeted, so Carney, presumably, you have no confidence in and should be replaced. That's your view. I think you're on record.
I've said that before. I'll say it as many times as you like. Yes.
But you say it again if you want.
All right. Carney, delenda est. Yes.
Yeah. You clearly also don't have much faith in the Chancellor, so he should also go.
That is a matter for the Prime Minister. Okay.
Let's say it is a matter for the Prime Minister. Who would be your choice to replace the current Chancellor?
I think in these things it is a matter for the Prime Minister. That's the constitutional norm. The Prime Minister has to form Her Majesty's government, but on the advice of the Prime Minister. I have confidence in the Prime Minister, and therefore I think I shouldn't pick and choose this minister and that minister. I've made comments about the Chancellor. I think he's become a semi-detached member of the Cabinet. I think he is freelancing and undermining the constitutional principle of collective responsibility. But just because the Chancellor undermines the Constitution doesn't mean that I should too.
But he's not the only one, is he? I mean, if we're going to be kicking people out for undermining collective responsibility, we're about to have quite a clear out of the Cabinet, it seems to me.
No, I'm not sure I follow that.
I think you follow it perfectly, but we'll take two more questions. So the chap with the sort of peroxide-y thing on his head, and similar up here again on the left. Yeah, the chap with the yes, you sir. Yeah. Please.
Hello. I think it's very interesting that you're prepared to joke about a lot of these issues when a lot of people right now are dying because of your party's policies. There are a lot of people who are very poor, and you say you care for the poor, but I don't think you can do. Taxes help the poor. What you're doing doesn't, and I don't think even you are that stupid to think that you care for the poor.
And, yes, please.
Hi. When I graduate from my degree at Queen Mary, I will have approximately sort of 50 grand's worth of debt. If I go on to do a master's, which I plan to do, it'll be even more than that. I'm also aware that your son is nearly done with his degree at Oxford, and I may be wrong, but did he have to take a student loan, and how does he plan to pay it off, if so? Do you think it's right that starting out in society, before you even take a job, there is inequality present?
Okay,
thank you. To come to the first question first, I just think that's wrong. In every sense, that the welfare net in this country is a working one, that it provides a basic level of support for everybody, and that is quite right. That taxation as a percentage of GDP is at the highest level it's been since the early 1970s. There's very little evidence that it would be possible to raise a higher percent of GDP in taxation, and that the top 1% of taxpayers at current rates are paying 27% of the total income tax take. In 1979, when tax rates were at 83% plus an unearned income surcharge got it up to 98%. The top 1% of taxpayers paid 6% of total income tax. So lower rates, a thriving economy, provides more revenue for the government to provide the public services that people need. And that is economically demonstrable across the world. And I think this slightly hysterical talk about people are dying is belittling the argument. It's just not true. And to come... Thank you for the voice of reason. To come to the gentleman, there's some confusion. Though I happen to think all my children are extraordinary geniuses, my eldest son is only 10, so I'm not sure how he's about to complete his degree at Oxford. I think Pitt the Younger went to Cambridge at the age of 11, but that's very exceptional. But I want to answer the serious underlying point. I believe in choice. And I believe that people who make choices should also have responsibility for those choices. And if you have decided to come to university, and may I say a great and successful university that you are at, one of the leading universities in the country, you have made that choice, which will lead to you having higher earnings. Out of those earnings, you will pay back the cost of your education. If you don't pay for it, it has to be paid for by somebody else. And you may think it will be paid for by some mythical billionaire. It won't be. National insurance contributions start being paid by people earning about £120 a week. Do you think they should pay for the choice that you're making? VAT is paid by everybody. So what you're really saying is that poorer people than you should pay for your education when you've made the choice and you will get the benefit. I think you've made the choice and you should have the responsibility. But there are great protections. Until you're earning £21,500, you won't pay back. And that's going to rise to £25,000. So that if it turns out that the education on which you've taken out the loan doesn't make you that extra money, then you don't have to pay back and the debt will be written off eventually. So it will depend on your success whether you contribute or not. And I think that's absolutely fair, because therefore you are free to make the choice with a safety net that you won't have this impossible burden in the event that you're not economically successful or that successful. But it means that you can take further choices in your life relatively free of that burden. And I think that's really important and a safeguard. But you know the best thing? That the poorest decile in our society have seen a 73% increase in places at universities since loans were increased. And do you know why that is? It's because the cap on places was removed. When it was all funded by the state retaliated by capping the total number of places. But who were least likely to get the places that were available with a limited pool? Those who had previously been let down by the education system, or whose parents had been let down by the education system. Once the cap was removed, ambitious people from the poorest section of society could suddenly go to university. As a Conservative, I'm really proud of that. I think it's the right policy and a good policy.
Okay, I'm very aware of the time, and I should just say that as soon as we've done this next round of questions, Jacob has to leave. So what we're going to do, let me make this clear. I'll take two more questions. I've got one on the pad as well. At the end of those questions, we'd like you to stay seated, please. There will be drinks outside for those of you that want to stay, and you can go and have a glass of god-awful university wine through that door. We will be leaving through that door, and there won't, I'm afraid, be time to do photos and all that sort of modern nonsense that some of you seem to like doing. So I'll take the last two. I'll take the woman here, with the white roll-necked top, and I'll take the woman in the sort of black. Your hand couldn't be any straighter if it had a rod through your arm. With the black top there, please. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
You said you would see yourself as kind of a classical liberal, and that people should be free to act as they wish. And so I was wondering what your stance was on the criminalisation or decriminalisation of drugs.
Okay. Yes, please.
You've referred a lot to history throughout your talk tonight, and you also mentioned that the voters need to feel like the Tory party can change the world. I just wondered, can the Tory party change the world, or are you a party that promotes stagnation or maybe even regression?
Well, okay, but as those are the last two questions, before I answer them, can I thank you very much for having me? It's been really interesting to come. Thank you for all the questions. I was told I would be put through the mill, and I think the questions have lived up to the billing. Thank you. But from my point of view, that makes it much more interesting. So I really appreciate that and the opportunity to discuss these issues. And Phil, thank you so much for inviting me. But to come to the two questions, the legalization of drugs. I think the state should always be very careful about what it makes illegal, but that in the case of drugs, the onus of proof is on the side of those who want to liberalize. What do I mean by that? There has been increasing evidence, particularly with cannabis, that it has serious psychological effects on people. And I think the people who are in favor of legalization need to show that those effects are not there. I've always thought in politics you should have very clear principles, but you have to have a dose of pragmatism as well, and you don't want to take undue risks. So, to take another example, gambling. If we didn't have any gambling laws, I would be very reluctant to introduce gambling laws. If you want to set up a bookmakers, if you want to have a bet amongst yourselves, why should the state interfere? But we've got very strict gambling laws. And the thing I've discovered as a constituency MP is that by and large they're quite successful. And I've had people come to my constituency surgery whose lives have been ruined by gambling. And is it wise of me, however much I believe in liberty, to say that my ideological belief in liberty should risk people absolutely destroying their lives because I make gambling easier? And the same applies to drugs, that ideologically, I see very clearly the argument for legalization. But then I know that it ruins people's lives. So the onus of proof, I think, is on people who want to legalize to say this will not have risks, this will be secure, this will be safe, it will not lead to more deaths or more crime or more lives being ruined. And so, without denying the ideology, I think in day-to-day politics you have to have a layer of pragmatism on top of it. Conservative Party, is it the party of change? Well, I think the role of the Conservative Party is to keep what doesn't need changing and to change what does. And that's easier said than done. But that I don't believe in perpetual revolution. I don't believe in throwing over the tables for the fun of it. But yes, lots of things need changing and improving. And the Conservative Party, when it's at its most successful, is a real engine of change. The brief, I don't know how long I've got, but Disraeli, 1874 to 1881, transformative social legislation on housing, on water, on public health, all about improving the condition of the poorest in society. Harold Macmillan building 300,000 houses a year, and Winston Churchill lifting all the post-war restrictions that still remained. And bear in mind, the socialists wanted to keep rationing going on forever because they thought it was best determined by the clever people in Whitehall. Douglas Jay said in 1947, the truth is the man in Whitehall really does know best. That is the antithesis of what I believe. The Conservative Party did its best, frees people up, and helps the condition of the poorest in society. Margaret Thatcher, transformative in terms of freeing the economy from detailed regulation, stopping the trade unions, ruining people's lives by the closed shop, by mass picketing, by all the bullying that went with that. And that's our challenge. What should we be doing now that liberates the people and helps them lead the lives they want and encourages that change? And I think it's housing, I think it's taxation, and I think it's lowering the price of food, clothing and footwear once we've left the European Union. And there are really important changes we can make based on our idea. There's one simple idea, ladies and gentlemen. You know better how to lead your life than I know how to lead it for you. And therefore you should be left to lead it for yourself, and I should take obstacles out of your way rather than pretending that nanny knows best. The only nanny who knows best is my nanny in personal circumstances.